It's time for story time.
Today's story will come from 5-Minute Stories, and today's fairy tale is The Princess and the Pea. Let the story time begin. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far away, there lived a handsome prince. He had loving parents, plenty of friends, and lived in a wonderful castle with a wonderful life. But one thing made him sad. He did not have a wife. The prince had always wanted to marry a princess, but he wanted her to be clever and funny and loving and kind. None of the princesses that he met at parties and balls, they wasn't quite right. Some of the princesses were too mean, and some were too rude. Some were too quiet, and others were just too loud. And some were just plain boring. So, the prince decided to travel the world in hopes of finding the perfect princess. He met many more princesses who tried to impress him with their beauty, their dancing, and their baking. But still none were quite right. I'm never going to meet the right princess, he sighed to himself. Oh, where is that girl of my dreams? Months passed without success, so eventually the prince headed back to his castle. Cheer up, my son, said the king. You are still young. One day you will meet a wonderful girl, just as I met your mother. The king smiled at the queen, but he was at a loss to know how to make the prince happy again. Then one night, when the king and the queen had begun to give up hope for their son ever finding a bride, there was a terrible storm. Thunder roared, lightning flashed, and the rain poured down. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the wooden castle door. I wonder who could be out on such a terrible stormy night, said the prince. When he opened the door, a pretty young girl stared back at him. She was soaked from head to toe. Oh, please, Your Royal Highness, may I come in for a moment? She pleaded. I was traveling to see some friends, but I got lost in the storm, and now I'm very cold and very wet. The prince ushered the poor girl in out of the wind and rain. You poor thing. You poor thing, said the queen. You must stay the night. You cannot travel in this weather. The prince smiled at the girl. What is your name? He asked her. I'm Princess Penelope, she replied. You are very kind. I don't want to be a bother to you. As the words of the princess, the queen smiled to herself. I wonder, she thought, but she didn't say anything. She took the girl's hand and said aloud, Of course not, my dear. Come in. Let's get you warm. Now, once the princess had changed into some dry clothes, the queen invited her to have some supper with the family. The prince listened contentedly as the charmed princess chattered away over their meal. He could not stop gazing at her. She was clever and funny and loving and kind. By the end of the evening, the prince had fallen in love. Now, the queen was delighted when she saw what was happening, but she wanted to be sure that Princess Penelope was a real princess. She went to the guest room in the castle and placed a tiny pea under the mattress. Then she told the servants to pile 20 more mattresses onto the bed Then the queen had 20 feathered quilts piled on top of the 20 mattresses. "Now we shall see if you are a real princess," muttered the queen to herself. The queen showed the princess to her room and tucked her into the towering bed. "Sleep well, my dear," she said. In the morning, the princess came down to breakfast, rubbing her eyes. "How did you sleep, my dear?" the queen asked her. The princess didn't want to be rude, but she couldn't lie. "I'm afraid I hardly slept a wink," she replied, stifling a yawn. "I'm so sorry, my dear," said the queen. "Was the bed not comfortable?" "There was so many lovely mattresses and quilts. It should have been very comfortable," replied the princess. "But I could feel something lumpy and bumpy, and now I'm black and blue all over." The queen grinned and hugged the girl to her. "That proves it," cried the queen. "Only a real princess could be able to feel a tiny pea through many, many mattresses and 20 feathered quilts." The prince was filled with joy. He had finally met the princess of his dreams. Not long after that, the prince asked Princess Penelope to be his wife. She happily agreed, and they were married in the castle. The prince was never unhappy again, and as for the pea, it was put in the Royal Museum as proof that perfect princesses do exist. The end. There was once a sweet and happy little girl whose granny made her a lovely red cape with a hood. The little girl loved it so much that she wore it everywhere she went. Soon, everyone became so used to her wearing it, they named her Little Red Riding Hood. "Little Red Riding Hood," said to her mother one morning, "Granny is not feeling very well. Take her this basket of food and see if you can cheer her up." Little Red Riding Hood loved to visit her granny, so she took the basket of food and set off right away. "Go straight to Granny's house and don't talk to strangers," her mother called after her. "Don't worry," sang Little Red Riding Hood as she went merrily on her way. Little Red Riding Hood skipped off through the woods. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping in the treetops, and she didn't have a care in the world. Very soon she met a wolf. "Well, hello there," said the wolf in a silky, low voice. "And where are you off to on this fine morning?" "I'm going to visit my granny," replied Little Red Riding Hood. Forgetting of her mother's warning, that is. "She's not feeling well. I'm taking her this food to make her feel better." The wolf licked his lips. "And where does your dear old granny live?" asked the wolf. "She lives in a cottage on the other side of the woods," replied Little Red Riding Hood. "It has pretty roses growing around the door." Is that so?" said the wolf. "Why, it sounds lovely." There were some beautiful wild flowers growing in the woods, and Little Red Riding Hood stopped to admire them. "Why don't you pick a bunch of those pretty flowers for your granny?" suggested the kind wolf. Little Red Riding Hood thought it was a great idea, and she stooped down to pick up some. As she was busy choosing the prettiest of the flowers, the wolf strolled away down the path, his tummy rumbling loudly. At the end of the path, he saw a cottage with roses growing around the door, just as Little Red Riding Hood said. The wicked old wolf knocked on the door. Come right in, my darling, called the grandmother, thinking it was Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf walked into the cottage, and before grandmother had a chance to call for help, the wicked creature opened his huge jaws and swallowed her up whole. Then he climbed into the bed, pulled the covers up to his chin, and waited. Soon, Little Red Riding Hood reached Granny's house with a basket of food and a beautiful bunch of wild flowers. "Won't Granny be pleased to see me?" she thought, and she knocked on the door. "Come right in, my darling," replied a strange, croaking voice. "Poor Granny," thought Little Red Riding Hood. "She doesn't sound at all well." Little Red Riding Hood looked in the kitchen, but her granny wasn't there. She looked in the sitting room, but her granny wasn't there either. Finally, she went into Granny's bedroom, and she gasped in surprise. "Granny," exclaimed Little Red Riding Hood, "your ears are absolutely enormous." "All the better to hear you with, my dear," replied a low, silky voice. "And your eyes are as big as saucers," gulped Little Red Riding Hood. "All the better to see you with," replied the wolf. "And your teeth are so pointed," gasped Little Red Riding Hood. "All the better to eat you with," growled a loud, hungry voice. The old wicked wolf jumped out of bed and gobbled up Little Red Riding Hood in one big gulp. Then he lay down on the bed and he fell asleep. Now, luckily, a woodcutter was working nearby, and he heard some very loud and growling snoring and it was coming from the little cottage. I don't like that sound," he thought. With his axe at the ready, he crept into Grandma's house. He tiptoed into the bedroom, and he found that wicked wolf fast asleep, with his tummy bulging fit to burst. "You wicked old wolf," cried the woodcutter. "What have you done?" He tipped the wolf upside down and shook him as hard as he could. And out fell, dazed and confused, Little Red Riding Hood, followed by her poor old granny. "It was dark in there," cried the little girl. "Thank you for saving us." But Little Red Riding Hood's granny was furious. She chased the wolf out of her bedroom, through the cottage, and out into the woods. The woodcutter and Little Red Riding Hood followed close behind her. Well, the wolf never returned, and Little Red Riding Hood never spoke to strangers ever again.
Today we'll be reading from the 5-minute stories. And today's story is How the Leopard Got His Spots. Let the story time begin. Long, long ago, Leopard lived on a hot, bare, sunny yellow plain in Africa. Giraffe and zebra lived there too, along with lots of deer, big and small, young and old. The animals were sandy yellow all over, just like the plain itself. Leopard was sandy yellow too, which wasn't good for the rest of the animals because leopard was hard to spot on the sandy yellow plain. He could lie in wait in the sandy yellow grasses and then jump out at them to catch them and eat them up whenever he wanted to. Giraffe and zebra and the rest of the animals lived in fear. Leopard, however, was very happy and never hungry. After a while, Giraffe and Zebra and the others had enough. They decided to move away from the sandy plain to find a better place to live. They walked and walked until they came to a huge forest where the sun shone through the trees, making stripy, speckly, patchy shadows in the sections of spotty, stripy sunshine. The animals hid themselves there, and while they hid, partly in the sun and partly in the shadows, their skins changed color. Giraffe's skin became covered with big, brown, blotchy spots, with blotchy shadows that he stood in. And Zebra's skin became covered with stripes from the stripy shadow he laid in. The other animal's skin became darker too, with wavy lines and patterns from the shadows around them. Back on the sandy plain, Leopard was puzzled. All the animals had disappeared, and he started to get hungry. Where have they all gone? He thought, and he asked Baboon. To the forest, said Baboon carelessly, and they've changed. You need to change too. Leopard started to ask Baboon what she meant by change. But baby Baboon needed feeding, so she was too busy to explain. Leopard set out for the forest. He walked and walked, and at last he found it. But all he could see was tree trunks. They were speckled, spotted, dotted, and splashed with the shadows. He couldn't see Giraffe or Zebra or any of the others, but he could smell them, so he knew where they were. Leopard lay down to wait. After a long, long time, something moved in the shadows, and a small deer trotted toward him. But sandy yellow Leopard wasn't hidden in the leafy green forest, so the deer saw him at once and skipped away. All Leopard could do was catch its tail. Too small to fill your belly, cried the deer. Please let me go. The deer was right about that. It was tiny and thin and not really worth bothering about, but Leopard kept hold of its tail anyway. What happened to all the animals? Asked Leopard. We've all changed, the deer replied. Now our skins are speckly, spotted, dotty, and splashy, just like the shadows in the forest. You only caught me because I'm young. I should have been more careful, said the deer. Leopard let the little deer go and sat down to think. So that's why I can't see Giraffe and Zebra and the rest of them in the forest, he thought. They've changed their skin to match the shadowy trees. If I'm going to catch them, do I need to change too? And how in the world can I do that? As he sat there thinking, more deer walked through the trees. When they moved, Leopard could see them clearly. When they stopped moving, they were hidden by the shadows. Leopard was easy to spot with his sandy yellow skin, so the deer didn't come too close. Leopard sat in the shadows a long, long time and licked his paws thoughtfully. Soon he began to notice something odd. His paws weren't sandy yellow anymore. There were small, dark spots on them, and there were spots on his tail too. Leopard looked around and realized that the spots on his skin matched the small, dark patches in the shadows he was lying in. Aha, he thought. The shadows have made me to have spots, just in the time that I've been lying here. That's how I can change my skin, just like Giraffe and Zebra and the rest of them. By this time, Leopard had grown tired from all the thinking and waiting. So he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up, a long, long time later, his skin was completely covered with small, dark spots made by the shadows of the trees. "Well, how wonderful," he said, looking at his new skin. "Now my skin is no longer sandy yellow, brownish. I can hide in the leafy green forest so that giraffe and zebra and the rest of them can't see me. Then, when they come close, I can leap out to catch them and eat them." With that, the spotty leopard set off into the speckly, blotchy, stripy shadow of the deep forest, where he happily lived ever after, eating and sleeping and not being spotted, and the other animals learned to hide from him as best as they could, too. The end.
Today's fairy tale will be how the rhinoceros got his skin. And then let the story time begin. How the rhinoceros got his skin. Long ago, among the tall trees near the shores of the Red Sea, lived a very rude rhinoceros. He had no manners then, and he has no manners now. You could recognize him by the horn on his nose, but in those days his skin was smooth and tight, and there wasn't a wrinkle in sight. He had 3 buttons on his tummy, which made it look like he was wearing a well-fitted jacket. One day, as Rhinoceros was searching for food, a traveler arrived on the beach and decided to bake a cake in his little oven. He sang to himself as he mixed flour and water and currants and plums and lots of sugar. Happy with his mixture, he popped it into the oven while he dozed under the burning sun. Soon, the sweet smell of cake filled the air. "Delicious," smiled the traveler when the cake was ready. In the nearby woods, Rhinoceros suddenly stopped in his tracks and lifted his head. And he sniffed and sniffed. "Cake," he snorted as the warm smell wafted above his horn. Then he followed his nose and headed for the beach. When the polite traveler saw him coming, he said, "Good morning." But the rude creature didn't even grunt. Instead, he charged ahead, knocking the cake out of the traveler's hands. Then he spiked the cake with his horn and lumbered back to his home. There he laid in the shade, enjoying every crumb. Meanwhile, the traveler was in a palm tree, and he was thinking and planning. "Just wait," he muttered. "I'll teach the rhino a lesson." A few weeks later, when searing heat prompted everyone to take to the sea, the traveler knew the time had come. He was sitting on the beach, wearing his hat to screen him from the ferocious sun, when he spied Rhinoceros. His eyes followed the creature as he heaved his great body along the sand. Not noticing the traveler, Rhinoceros finally stopped. Rhinoceros slowly undid his 3 buttons, took off his skin, and carried it over his shoulder as he went down into the sea to bathe. Leaving his skin at the edge of the water, he waddled into the sea. The traveler immediately jumped up. He danced around the skin and rubbed his hands with glee. "I'm ready," the traveler cried. "Just you wait and see." Then he set back off to his camp. As the traveler, who only ever ate cake and rarely ever cleaned up, there were plenty of crumbs all around his camp. "Lots of crumbs, crumbly crumbs," he sang as he quickly filled his hat with the stale cake crumbs. Then he raced back to the beach. Picking up the skin of the rhinoceros, the traveler sprinkled inside the lots of dirty, tickly cake crumbs and some baked currants. Then he left the skin for the rhinoceros. Then he climbed to the top of the palm tree, and there he waited. Rhinoceros took his time in the sea, laid on his back, and he blew bubbles, in through his nose. He splashed and never caring about the others that were in the water. Finally, as his great tummy started to rumble, and feeling much cooler as he swam, Rhinoceros returned to the beach. Thinking about what he was going to eat, Rhinoceros picked up his skin and buttoned it up. No sooner had he finished closing that last button than the crumbs began to itch. He wriggled and wriggled. He began to scratch, but that only made it worse. "Ow! Ow!" he cried loudly. Then he lay down on the sand and rolled and rolled and rolled. But every time he rolled, the cake crumbs dug into him, making it more and more uncomfortable. He was beginning to feel very hot again and very, very crabby. He lumbered up against the palm tree and rubbed himself and the trunk against the trunk. But still, the itching continued. He pressed his shoulders so hard against the tree that he rubbed his skin into a great fold. Then his legs started to itch, so he rubbed them up and down the tree until folds appeared on both legs. Now he was feeling very tired, and he was pressing his itchy tummy against the tree. He rubbed off every button. Finally, a huge fold of skin appeared across his tummy. The traveler looked down from the palm tree, watching his plan working. The rhinoceros became more and more bad-tempered as the cake crumbs continued to itch and scratch. Feeling exhausted and very angry, Rhinoceros finally gave up and he headed back home. And from this day, every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all because of the cake crumbs inside. The end. Thank you for joining me on It's Time for Story Time.
You did a great job with reading today. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified of new books weekly.